we are. Here's a little bit about Tony. Tony has been an atheist since he was a toddler, but he didn't tell anybody. He kept it to himself for a while. He's been a humanist for about 8 years. He's currently the vice president of CNYHA. He's also a former president of the Syracuse Atheists. And Tony has also been an avid amateur astronomer since 1986 when his father took him to a viewing of Halley's Comet. He's now also serving as president of the Syracuse Astronomical Society. And in his spare time, while he's not doing all those things, he works at Lockheed Martin testing radar systems. Welcome, Tony.
You all are going to regret applauding for me today. All right. Give me just a moment while I set up here. Okay, part two. When we talked first about the roots of humanism, this was, I don't know, 6 months ago, something like that. Started off the talk kind of focused on astronomy, on the role of astronomy, because I'm an amateur astronomer, and I do love any excuse I can find to talk about the stars around people. And so I kind of wanted to talk about like what role astronomy played in the development of early humanism. And I talked a little bit about like the role of the Assyrian and Sumerian civilizations, how they used the stars in a slightly different way. Like in early history, people looked at the stars and they thought the gods were talking to them through the motion of the planets and the stars. But gradually, they just started to observe. They started to pay attention to motions and positions of the stars and when they came up, when they set, rather than trying to impose some meaning on the stars. They just started recording data. So anyway, that was the purpose of part one. As I was digging into, doing homework for part one, I kind of realized that the roots of humanism are far larger than that. I couldn't just remain focused only on astronomy. So I've had to kind of broaden things a little bit. So where do we leave off? We left off by talking about all of the different civilizations and ideas that funneled into ancient Greece. In particular, talked about the Assyrians and how they kind of started this practice of just observing the heavens and reporting. Part of the reason for the Assyrians to do this is that, they still had there was still a religious component to what they were doing. They were still trying to understand why eclipses occurred and what it meant when the moon turned blood red, and whether or not, the stars were aligned in such a way where they thought they could be successful in battle. So there was that sort of divine component of astronomical observation, but there was also a practical need. Like you wanted to know when it was time to plant your crops. So you looked for Arcturus rising in the east in the springtime. Once you started seeing that, you had to get busy on your plot of land. They were very meticulous about how they recorded the planets. In fact, the first recorded observation of the retrograde motion of Mars was recorded by the Assyrians. They basically said Mars moved left when it should have moved right, and we don't understand why. They effectively wrote that down in their records. So that was one of the first recordings we ever saw of that observation. We talked a little bit about the Sumerians and what contributions they made. We talked about the Sumerians kind of formed up their understanding of how the stars move. They understood, for instance, that there were some stars in constellations that remained visible all year round, circumpolar stars. They understood that the North Star was a special star that never moved, even though all the other ones did. They understood the difference between stars and planets. They knew that planets were something different. They didn't know what they were, but they knew they were different. They weren't stars. They also understood, for instance, that the moon moves 15 degrees per month. I'm sorry, 15 degrees per week, right? 360 degrees all year round. So that told them something about how the speed at which objects move, and then they understood that planets don't follow that rule. So they recorded that too. We talked a little bit about the Babylonians too, how they applied a mathematical understanding. That that represented a real change. The Babylonians, more than anything, influenced the Greeks. They recorded a lot of data about how planets move that were used later on by the ancient Greeks. All right. So the beef of part 2 here is to get into the bowels of ancient Greek society. So here we go. So I want to remain focused on just a few questions. And when I talk about the roots of humanism, I want to understand where it started, and how and what influence the Greeks had over that process. Who were its founders? Where did they come from? And what was their motivation? Really? Uh, nope, that's not what we're going to do.
Yeah, he's still seeing the left slide. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm being recorded. YouTube video.
Wanted to do this, right? We swap this. That's right. Okay, well, I'm not seeing the right screen here then. Okay, so we're not seeing the right screen, so okay, still good? Okay, all right. Technical issues aside, the Greeks never had to deal with Zoom. So, timeline of humanism. We'll introduce a little bit of a timeline, and we're going to get started with a fellow named Protagoras, about 5 BC. Can you get out of the way, Tony? Wait, I want to hide this too. There we go. Okay, so Protagoras was a Greek philosopher. He lived around 5th century BC, in or near Athens. Athens was basically the hub of a lot of this activity. He was the first to really argue for a human-centric set of values. This is, 490 BC Athens was kind of it wasn't an extremely religious place, although they had the Greek gods. They were willing to, hear people talk about other things. It's famous for saying, it is not to the gods that we should look for establishing standards, but instead to ourselves. He might as well have established an idea of humanism right then and there. Protagoras was skeptical about the traditional religious beliefs of his day, so much so that he did not escape the attention of the authorities in Athens. He found himself arrested and thrown out of Athens. I'm going to minimize this. Socrates came along in 469, so he was aware of the work of Protagoras. The philosopher of morals and ethics, also living in Athens. Strangely enough, Socrates never wrote anything of his own. We only know about him through the writings of Plato, one of his students, and several other philosophers that he influenced. the Socratic method, I actually remember taking that class of this in high school. Our high school football coach was kind of an amateur philosopher. He kind of talked to us about the Socratic method, which is a way of driving toward a higher truth. You would think of it as that. But this practice kind of got him in trouble in Athens. He would take, for instance, he would challenge a political leader to talk about why they thought the way they did. And Socrates would basically get him to admit that he didn't know what he was doing. You don't make friends and win influence in any society by that. In 399, he was accused of impiety, which is sort of not being respectful to the gods. He was arrested, tried, and executed. They made an example of him. In the years following his death, Socrates' impact on philosophy, you can't overstate it. He produced Euclid, Aristippus, and Antisthenes. I'm going to get some of these wrong, so correct me if I missed them. Among many others. He had many students. In Greek society, education was a privilege of the rich. The students who attended Socrates' school were the wealthiest of Greek society. The nice part about being wealthy, other than being wealthy, is that you could travel, and this is how Greek ideas spread throughout the Greek Empire. He established his own school of philosophical thought, and a great many of his students went on to establish their own schools, not just in Athens, but in Macedonia and northern Greece and Sparta and all kinds of other locations, Syracuse among them. Not just Syracuse, the one in Italy. The Stoics, who his students were referred to as, they relied heavily on Socrates. Several other ideas came up, including hedonism, which I don't know much about, and Platonism. Speaking of Plato, he is next on my list. Greek philosopher and student of Socrates. He taught Aristotle, having taken over his own school. His school in Athens was referred to as just the Academy. You don't need a name when you're that famous. Plato, as a young man, was a member of the circle surrounding Socrates. He wrote down a lot of Socrates' lectures. Plato developed something called the theory of forms, which I remember talking about when I was a student. And to be honest, I didn't understand it then. Plato's argument was that in order to understand something foundational like beauty, truth, or justice, you had to have some idea of what a perfect form of those things was. And he tried to argue that, and this kind of ties into when I talk about the part one about this idea that Greeks pursued perfection in everything that they did. And so, Plato really did believe that there had to be some perfect form of these kinds of things, just like there's a perfect sunset and a perfect horse and a perfect carriage. He tried to understand what perfection in the realm of human thought and emotion looked like. That's why he called this the theory of forms. And while he didn't have anyone necessarily who told him that that was wrong, he did have some students that didn't understand what he was talking about. Plato's Academy, which was founded in 380, was basically a precursor to the modern university. Plato involved himself in almost every aspect of human affairs at that time. The sciences, biology, physics, you name it. So one of his students, Aristotle, is next on our list. He's simply known by Dante as the philosopher. Dante's books 1,000 years later refer to Aristotle, but he never referred to him by name. No need when you're Aristotle. Born in 384 in Sagira, if I got that right, in Greece, on the border of Macedonia. He had some connections to the Macedonian royal court. The king of Macedonia, Philip II, had Aristotle teach his son, a kid named Alexander, who would later become Alexander the Great. He studied under Plato in Athens, 367 BC. He basically invented the scientific method. He pioneered a system of examination that affected just about every science you can think of. The list is long: biology, physics, everything. He had a fundamental disagreement with his teacher, and he was, because Aristotle was so focused on like the scientific method, the idea that you can apply rationalism to understand the things around you. He could not seem to get behind this idea of forms, this idea of perfection. This is a fundamental difference between Aristotle and Plato. And it would lead Aristotle to go on and establish his own school called the Lyceum later on. Yeah, 335 BC. Aristotle set up his own school mostly as a reaction. He was under the impression that he was going to take over for his teacher, Plato, and he was going to be awarded control of that school. Well, but Plato didn't give it to him. He gave it to his son to run the school. And so Aristotle, feeling a little bit hurt about that and dejected, decided to set up his own school. Aristotle believed that there was a final purpose for human existence, to be possessed by a good spirit. That was the point of life. And this happiness could be realized by just being a good person. That's a very humanistic thought. Aristotle was what's called a teleologist, one who believes that there's an end cause or a final purpose in life. He kind of strayed from this idea of a rational life when he proposed this idea of there being a sort of a purpose in life. That's one of the things that you hear religious people talk about. Like, what's your purpose in life if not God? Aristotle, this is kind of understandable just given the circumstances that he lived in. He lived in Athens not long after the Macedonian king Philip II basically attacked and conquered Athens. So he was under the rule of the Macedonian court. And Aristotle had connections to Macedonia. And he was reading through some of his philosophy. He was kind of he had a little bit of an authoritarian bent. Like, he actually encouraged Alexander the Great to conquer everything he could conquer, because he believed that prowess on the battlefield was one of the great achievements that made you who you are. And so he kind of, when he taught Alexander the Great, Aristotle basically steered him in that direction. He claimed the existence of a prime mover. Boy, is that something you hear a lot. Who was it? Ben Shapiro just recently put a YouTube video out talking about how there must be a prime mover. So this disagreement between Aristotle and Plato really became the foundation of early Christianity. And you can see, like, we're still debating this now. There's no prime mover, but we're still talking about it. And the fact that we're still talking about it has to do with this whole philosophy.
Yeah, I was going to say, medieval theologians loved Aristotle.
Yeah.
The organization,
right.
The whole first cause business. They wanted to make theology systematic.
Yeah.
Had written, so he was really popular.
I think if you, if you read through a lot of Aristotle's stuff, you can see he's kind of torn. There's a really strong rational component behind what he does, and that's that he argued that that's how you know the world, by observing, by recording information. But then toward the end of his life, he kind of veered off course a little bit and talked about this idea that, well, there has to be some prime mover in the universe. There has to be some cause, some first cause. And I interpret this as being kind of related to the authoritarian. He's letting his authoritarian streak show a little bit.
But it could be part of the business, right? It wouldn't have to be, a human-like entity.
Right.
In the state of the world.
Right, sure. But I mean, this notion of there must be a perfect form or perfect reason for things to be the way they are kind of drove the whole philosophical discussion. But Aristotle had kind of a problem with that. Like, well, there's a lot of things in the world that aren't perfect, but we can understand why they're not perfect, and we can still study it. There's nothing wrong with accepting the fact that something is imperfect. But people of Plato's sort of bent said, no, there must be there has to be some perfection involved in what we do, and it's just a matter of we don't understand it. So summarizing, humanism refers to how Greek art and literature put the human experience at the center of events. When you think about the Iliad that Homer wrote, this is really a discussion of human beings. Like there's very little discussion of gods. It's primarily a discussion about human beings. Greek humanists are interested in how each of us must come to grips with and make the best use of our inherent human imperfection. And Greek humanism also refers to the Greeks' emphasis on the human body and on the beauty of it. Yeah, I'm showing the picture, guys. Yeah, I mean, the Greeks also plant some dual seeds of both philosophy and democracy. The whole idea of the Lyceum and Plato's Academy was to openly discuss these ideas in such a way where you can hear ideas that aren't right, but you still drive toward truth. Right? It's okay to have an opinion, but all of that put aside, you have to drive toward truth. It's relatively short. I stopped the talk here because the next step is to talk about the collapse of Greece and the spin up of Rome and all of that, which is way too big to talk about in the short. So I'm going to pause here for part 2. That's it.